he has quite a bit of experience designing products. He's, as president of Integrated Design Systems, located in Oyster Bay, New York. It sounds like designed probably dozens of, maybe more, of products, including a lot of medical devices, and hundreds of products ranging from MRI machines to pool chlorinators under the direction of Mr. Paloian. Michael's education as an industrial designer and a plastics engineer has provided him with a unique set of design skills, enabling him to design from products from concept to production. And so he's going to share some of his experience doing just that on an integrated design of a handheld hyperspectral imaging camera, which is an award winner just in last year's Medical Design Excellence Awards given at this very group, UBM. So welcome, Michael, to the stage.
Thank you very much, Scott. So as Scott said, many of the presentations that were given today were a perfect segue into what you're going to listen to now. And it saved me a lot of time because I don't have to describe all the research that was done on the front end. I'm going to sort of breeze through that because I'm going to discuss a 2-year project in 40 minutes. So we have to go pretty fast. It'll be dense in terms of information content. If you have questions, please ask. But I have to cover a lot of ground, so I'm going to be moving quickly. There's about 40 slides here. The purpose of this case study is to describe the interrelationships between industrial design, product design, and plastics engineering. Okay, and those 3 disciplines were carried from concept to production, and I call this integrated design. And it's a great term for this design methodology, because instead of thinking in a linear fashion, as engineers do, if you look at a product design as an industrial designer, you're looking at it more in a matrix fashion, on a macroscopic level and working in, okay? Now, our client, this was a startup, okay, you've heard of startups in previous conversations today, or seminars today, and they wanted to transform this prototype you see in the upper left-hand corner here. Let's see if I can get this, I guess I hear this right, no, it doesn't work. Anyway, in the upper left-hand corner, that was a functional prototype of this hyperspectral imaging camera. Matter of fact, like most medical products, many times companies tend to take the prototype and they launch it as a production unit. I see this happen all the time. They don't change anything. I've seen it happen with multi-billion-dollar companies as well as smaller companies. And the product failed, okay? And a few years later, it was actually put on a back burner for a number of years until it was resurrected. And resurrected so that the new president of the company wanted to transform it into a small handheld device. It gave me a lot of work. But the handheld device had to be essentially battery operated and perform all the functions of the cart-based system with the exception of the printer, okay? And this is more in line with what they had in mind, and this is ultimately what the product ended up evolving into, okay? Now, for those of you that are not familiar with hyperspectral imaging, without me getting into a lot of details, because we don't have time for that, essentially using visible light, the spectrum of light, which is absorbed differently by different substrates. If you're projecting light onto different surfaces, depending on the substrate, it'll absorb and reflect wavelengths back. And in this case, blood happens to absorb a certain series of wavelengths of light, and depending on the oxygen concentration in the blood, you'll get a different light reflection pattern back to a camera, and that could be interpreted and correlated to the oxygen content in the blood. And in this case, you can actually quantitatively analyze the oxygen saturation level, the oxyhemoglobin level, and the deoxyhemoglobin level in the blood. So what good is that? It's excellent for examining tissue, healthy skin tissue, especially for diabetic patients, burn patients, and a number of other in another number of other instances where knowing the potential of the wound being healed is critical for the patient's well-being. So these images are not just a pretty picture, but they're actually, each one of those pixels represents a quantitative point which will define the oxygen level in the blood right underneath the skin. So industrial designers, are there industrial designers in this group? Okay, good. Industrial designers essentially define products. If you're a product designer, you're really interested in the product embodiment or the shape of the product. And these are based on the function and the technology of the product. And they have to be, as you've heard today, many of the presentations have discussed user needs, market requirements, environments of use. These all become familiar to you if you've sat through some of the previous presentations. So industrial designers are basically taking the function and the technology and interpreting it to satisfy those user requirements. And the considerations typically are those of aesthetics, human factors, a critical key component. I went to RISD, and that was one of our key considerations in designing products was human factors. I use the term product character, and what I mean by that is when you're designing, it's not just a mechanical process or a technical focus. You really there's a certain amount of interpretation, artistry involved, and you're imparting a character into the product. And that character is really like an artist. It's up to the designer to impart the proper, appropriate image that becomes an intuitive connection with the end user. So that's a key, that's like a magical quality that you're basically benefiting by using industrial designers. And someone earlier said made a comment about the interrelationships between ease of use and safety. I don't know if you heard that conversation going on earlier. I happen to be, I found it to be a very profound statement. I happen to agree with that person. I think that if it's easy to use, it doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. But if it's safe to use, by definition, it has to be easy to use. Because if it's overly complicated, it's not a good design, in my opinion. There's the environments of use. Okay, you heard some of the previous speakers talk about that. These are all considerations in the design of this particular product, and cultural influences as well. None of these can be underestimated. The very thing that you underestimate is the very thing that will come back and haunt you later on, and that will be the Achilles heel in a product. And then, of course, there are your marketing requirements. In the early part of a project, you know, when you're designing something, this is the most important step in any project, is defining those specifications. And the specifications are not a contract that can't be, I mean, you think of it as a contract or a set of guidelines. Those guidelines are not guidelines that should be cast in stone. They should be flexible, because what's going to happen is as the project evolves, your needs, the awareness of the different phases of development will change, and it'll cause some of these specifications to change. So, but they have to change in a logical fashion, okay? But initially, you're trying to define a product function, the technology, both current and future, which will also have an impact on the longevity of the product, okay? The clinical environments, the physician-patient interaction, okay? Software user interface, system overview and data acquisition, storage, retrieval. And these parameters happen to be those that were specific for this particular product, okay? These all had to be sort of quantified, understood, and incorporated in the design process and thinking. And then identification of internal components. So unlike user interface, which is primarily focused on the presentation of information to the user, industrial designers are also very interested in the overall configuration of the product, which is dependent on the components. And then, of course, regulatory compliance. We don't want to forget about that, key consideration. So, after our initial set of specifications were sort of mapped out, okay, we started, now, like in any project, okay, this is, I don't know how many people, there's one industrial designer in the audience, but in any project, it's always, in the first few months or weeks of development, the set of guidelines or parameters for components and the product specifications, they're all kind of loose. So in this particular case, the definition of what was being packaged was quite ill-defined. So you look at these little boxes, those are fairly primitive forms, and we, based on our assessment of what was possible, we thought that this thing could be packaged in something that's maybe a little bit larger than an iPhone type package, okay? And that's what those boxes represent. Then we went through a study of orienting them in different orientations in space. We went to clinics, we talked to some top physicians and clinicians, having them compare this to the original product. This was a sort of a phase one brush of interacting with the end user, okay? And this was critical. Now, again, this is an iterative process. This wasn't just a single interview that just terminated after this one visit. There were multiple visits to numerous clinics in this particular program. And concurrently with that, we were also examining the logic of the structure of how the information in a previous product, which you see in the upper left-hand corner, how that information was presented to the user, and exactly how it was stored, and what is actually being analyzed, and how is it interpreted by the end user. And we found it to be incredibly convoluted because it's more of a scientific type of device. And so I personally went through, I studied those menus in depth and streamlined the whole process and tried to integrate it into a larger picture, which not only included the device itself, but a larger system where the information would be uploaded to a cloud and a central storage system, and then how it would be retrieved from there. So it was a fairly complicated, independent study that was running in parallel with the embodiment of the product. Our initial concepts evolved from those small form factors to exploring a possibility of using a standard display from either an iPhone or a tablet, and integrating these devices in with the technology, okay? And that's what you see here. You'll notice extremely different form factors, and we did this intentionally to explore how and what method or technology would be most appropriate for the product. By the way, I'll give you an idea of time. Up to this point, this was probably about 4 to 5 months to get to this point, okay? And then all of a sudden, we quickly realized that the form factors and the components that we were proposing were, I want to make sure I'm on time, were they were too abstract for the end user. The end user didn't relate to it, okay? It was a problem. And that in conjunction with some technical issues that we ran into, okay? So I went back and re-examined everything, cleaned the slate, and came up with an idea of, let's come up with something that's more familiar in terms of the embodiment. You know, when you're designing something where there's no precedent, it's a blank slate. You can do whatever you want. You know, this thing could have looked like a Mickey Mouse head, you know, with eyeglasses. I mean, it could be anything you want. So the form factor has to have some logic to it, and the form following function to a great extent. but also it has to have some relevance to the end user. So I came up with the idea of maybe using a camera as a metaphor to embody the technology. And that actually was a smart move, because as the project evolved, we realized that the components were getting bigger and heavier, etc. So this form factor allowed us to expand the device to accommodate those changes in technology. And that's what you see here. The product is now taking a shape that's more similar to what you saw in the first slide. Okay, you'll notice that in this iteration, the camera body, if I'll call it a camera, has no handles. It looks more like a conventional SLR camera. Okay, and we realized that when we took it to the clinics and clinicians and physicians were handling it, this was going to be an expensive device. They were quite uncomfortable because we loaded it so that it would simulate the weight. And by this time it was up to about 3-4 pounds. They were now finding it awkward to handle and grip. So we interjected. If you look at the far left picture, there's just there's a handle just on the right side of the device. It was not preferred. Our client wanted to minimize the size, the perceived size of the device, so we only ended up adding one handle. Okay, but after subsequent interviews and design refinements, we had to add 2 handles, and that was perfectly balanced. And we also made sure that the center of gravity of all the components was properly located so that it was closer to the user, so that you wouldn't have a torque on the wrists. Okay, so a lot of thought and engineering went into that. And again, this was through multiple interviews with end users. By the way, if you look at this image, I want to point something out to you. This was a major. This little detail imposed a huge impact on the design of the product and the complication of the design. If you notice the image in the upper right-hand corner, the handles are fairly basic. If you were an engineer, you'd love that because it's a fairly simple thing to mold. Okay. But as an end user, you wouldn't be too thrilled with it because it wasn't, it's like holding a hammer or something. It wasn't really designed to be ergonomically optimized. So we went back and explored different handles. And what drove this was not how you're going to make it. We threw that out the window. What's comfortable? What is ergonomically optimized for the end user? And this form factor you see on the right, which sort of derives from some of the clay images you see on the left. Everybody's like a fan of 3D modeling. I've been using that technology for 30 years. I mean, not 3D modeling, 3D printing. To model something like that and 3D print it is a nightmare. Take a piece of clay and squash it in your hand and you get like a perfect rendition in 5 seconds. But now to translate that design, you put some of those shapes look like bones into a 3D image. It's pretty complicated. Those are scans, by the way. Okay, those are 3D scans from a clay model. But we ended up sculpting this and then modeling it in the computer and applying it to the prototype and verifying the design. And then we came up with a perfected embodiment, at least from a conceptual standpoint of what the product should be, all right? And this design had to comply with proper placement of buttons, keeping it simple, easy to operate, always the user being the center of the design, okay? The user drove the design, not the technology. The technology was nothing more than a means to an end. Then optimizing the location of the handles and the buttons, and then introducing a docking station, which you see here in the upper right-hand corner, which provided charging, data transmission, and user interaction with the display, as well as a safe storage space for the device. We then went back again to various clinics, world leaders in various areas of diabetic research, et cetera, and had the product examined again. And we finally got a very positive feedback from the device and from the people that we interviewed. And at that stage, we had a functional prototype that was, rapid prototype printed. But all that did was provide us with a means of verifying that everything could be packaged in a device that we had. It had no functional value in terms of structure. If you dropped it on a floor, it would break. If you twisted it too much or exposed it to too high a temperature, it would distort. So it had limitations on how it could be used. So we had to take that design now and translate that into a manufactured product. And somebody said earlier, there's a huge gap between the prototype and the production. I am a big advocate of that statement. I mean, the amount of work it takes to get to a functional prototype could vary anywhere from 25 to 50% max of a product development cycle. The 50% to the 100% mark is the remainder to get it from that prototype to a production unit. And when you get into plastics, there's no cushion. If you make a mistake, in this case, the molds were in excess of $750,000. So if there was one mistake, a mistake could be as simple as specifying the wrong material. You've just blown not only a huge schedule, critical schedule, but you've blown a huge amount of money because you have essentially a boat anchor for a tool. So there's no forgiveness in this transition, okay? And there's no way to verify it. You have to go to the finish line with quite a bit of knowledge. So it's easy to go back, and this is very typical. I've been involved in a number of projects throughout my career. And depending on who you're working with, some engineers are naysayers. You can't do this, you can't do that. You talk to them, you want to sort of cry because you can't do anything but breathe, maybe. And then other ones are more optimistic, okay? So the naysayers will take a design and say you can't do it and degrade it to a point where you've lost all the design intent. The key is to take your design and preserve it and translate it, be smart enough to maintain the design intent and carry it through to a production design, okay? And that's the challenge. So that means maintaining overall form and proportions. The previous speaker was talking about what is great design. It's maintaining proportions, okay? Proportions I could talk about for hours. I'm not going to get into it, but it's a huge topic, okay? Maintaining the ergonomic features. The handles that you spent so much time designing, maintain the design integrity. Maintain the details. Okay, in this particular design, we tried to minimize the number of seams, okay, so for ease of cleansing and minimizing crevices for bacterial growth, etc. Concealing hardware, specifying surface finish and quality. All these things have to be accounted for when you're translating a design from a concept to a production product. Minimizing gaps, understanding tolerances, and minimizing the number of crevices. I talked about that. And then when you get into the engineering aspects, especially from a plastic standpoint, you have to understand what the terms knit lines and gate marks and sink marks and swirls. These are all processing related issues that pertain to the quality of the product and its integrity, okay? And its functional integrity as well. Establishing and maintaining quality standards. If you don't do that, you end up in arguments with your suppliers because what he thinks or she thinks is good is not good enough for you. So those things have to be established by you as the designer so that the design intent is maintained. And of course, all these things have to comply with regulatory agencies, environmental conditions, thermal conditions, UV, chemicals, an entire array of EMI, RFI, all these things are environmental conditions. They all have to be compliant with those conditions, as well as the most, a key thing is if you can't assemble a product, you don't have a product. So designing it for ease of manufacturing is critical, okay? And that, again, is a human factors consideration. So when you're getting involved in this translation with a product that's primarily plastic, which is the case here, the material selection is a critical step in that evolutionary development, all right? And in addition to that, selecting a process. There are multiple processes to manufacture plastic parts. It's not just injection molding. You can do it a number of ways. There's an understanding of the tool design and how the molds have to be constructed to basically replicate the design you're trying to manufacture. So, in terms of physical properties, in this particular instance, we were looking for plastics that were resistant to disinfectants. Somebody mentioned that earlier, and I thought that was a very valid point. That's not an easy thing to do, by the way, because some of these disinfectants are so harsh. They'll just, cause all kinds of stress, cracking, and premature failure in a product much earlier than you ever expected. So that's a key driver in selecting the proper resin. UV stability. When you start adding up all these criteria, the pyramid, there's like about, a couple of 100,000 different plastics on the market. That pyramid quickly shrinks, very quickly, and then you end up with a handful, okay? There's high impact strength, custom colors, ease of pad printing or decorating, okay? Dimensional stability during molding. That's a critical factor because some plastics have great chemical resistance, but you can't mold them to twist and bend, and they don't hold tolerances too well. And then there's rigidity, flame retardancy to comply with UL. And in this particular case, the plastic also had to be easily bonded. So some of these requirements are conflicting, okay? And with the hundreds of thousands of plastics on the market, it's virtually impossible to know everything that's available to you. So a lot of times it's good for you as a developer to reach out to someone that knows a lot more than you. That's what I do all the time. And reach out to resin suppliers or distributors to get their input to help you sort of narrow down your options, okay? For injection molding, let me see how much time I have. I have to end at 3, right? I have 15 minutes?
Yeah, 15 minutes. Yeah.
I better speak faster, okay? You've got understanding tool design, mold flow, tolerance variations, problems with sink marks, gate location, reinforcing additives, location of knockout pins. This is an example of tool design and understanding how the tools are designed, which has a huge impact on the design of the product, okay? And this is what I mean by maintaining design intent. These handles you can't injection mold. You can't mold that part conventionally, all right? And also, we had specified an elastomeric wraparound around the screen to prevent water from going in, behind the screen when you're cleaning it. So how do you get the seal around it? How do you put the two parts together? How do you attach your button? How do you pass the wires through the product? How do you attach the rear cover so that you don't really see any hardware? And then how do you put another elastomeric bumper in the front? So all these things had to be questioned, and then the answers had to be quickly answered. And to answer some of these, overmolding is a process that was used to achieve some of these things. And the handles I'm going to talk about in a second. See, this is an example of overmolding where you actually shoot one plastic in, and then in some cases you can do it in the same machine. Sometimes you have to take the part out of one machine, put another injection molding machine and overmold an elastomeric material on top of it. You get a good chemical bond. So the selection of those two materials is critical, because if you don't have compatible materials, they won't adhere to each other, okay? I'm going to skip through these because I'm going to be running out of time. Then I talked about knit lines and flow. Well, if you look at this part, it has these little thin ribs these are light emitting diodes that went around this circular pattern here. When you take a plastic material and depending on how the part's gated, the material will knit. And what I mean by knit, it flows through around those openings, and then it sort of bonds as it comes together. And those points are weak points. So you don't want to have those in the middle of a thin web like that because it'll break. But if you gate it in the middle, as I'm showing here with that little purple dot, and it flows out the other way, you don't have any knit lines in the weak spots. So this should have to be considered early on in your thinking, okay? These pieces were bonded in the secondary operations. Again, you have to find the right adhesive, understand the right joint design, and also how it's going to be applied, and how thick the adhesive is, what the viscosity is, what the heat temperature, chemical resistance are of the adhesive, because an adhesive is a polymer, okay? So I'm going to skip through this because I'm going to be running out of time. What am I, how come I'm going through the, oh, what happened here? Oh, all right. All right, so anyway, the handle, I want to get to this. The handle, we wanted to minimize seams, okay? And we had to consider what's the best molding process, how do you assemble it if you're going to assemble it, how does it affect aesthetics, structural integrity, etc. So ideally, it would have been great to mold it as one piece, but that's something we had to look at. How do you do it? Because you can't do it conventional injection molding. Another way to do it was to mold it like you have, like you see with a power tool, molded in 2 pieces or 3 pieces, where you have a front handle. That's why I colored it in that blue color, which would have to be then assembled. You'd end up seeing screws, okay? And the thing would look like this. It would look like a mess. It would totally ruin the aesthetics of the product, plus to clean it would be a nightmare, all right? And from a structural standpoint, if you drop that thing, it would break, okay? So I really wanted to mold it in one piece. That was my vision from the very beginning. And we considered structural foam, but it had limitations. Conventional injection molding, it would have been too many parts. And gas counter pressure is another process similar to structural foam. Again, it was questionable. By the way, the number of people in the country that could do this, the pool is very small, okay? And the process that we selected was gas-assisted injection molding. And I don't think we have time to discuss the process in detail, but with this process, we're able to mold those handles an integral part of the main body. And I found one molder in the country that could do it. And I did quite a bit of research. The molder happened to be Mac Molding. I think they might be here at the show, I'm not sure. But they did a fantastic job. Now we had to change the geometry of the part ever so slightly. So that, see that picture in the upper left-hand corner? The sort of orange colored and blue? That's how the part is split. It was a pretty complicated tool, okay? So the handle, which was designed as a freeform, we had to change the curvature of the handle just ever so slightly so all the parting lines would flow right through the handle. You could mold it in an open and closed mold. That was a lot of work, okay? And then we did a mold flow analysis. We found out there were some problems and we modified the design to accommodate that. Again, at this stage of the design, we were working fairly intimately with the chosen molder, a key part of a design process like this. And I'm going to skip through here. So we went through a comprehensive review of the entire design, made a number of modifications, thinning walls, and talking about tolerances and clearances, etc. And again, when you're involved in a situation like this, you want your molder or your partner, whether it's a molder or a sheet metal supplier or I don't know, a PC board supplier, doesn't matter who that vendor is, you want that vendor to be your partner. When I was younger, I was not that smart, and I used to be quite adversarial, and I used to tick everybody off, and nobody wanted to work with me. And I learned through the School of Hard Knocks that that's not the proper way to do things. And when a molder feels comfortable with your decisions, and they feel like you're smart enough and dedicated enough to carry the responsibility to the finish line, they'll work with you. If they feel like you're going to just throw the ball throw the ball over the wall, let them have to deal with everything, you're not going to get a good situation. You'll have every excuse in the world why it didn't work. So you want to have them buy into your design, and that requires their confidence in you. So in terms of production considerations, this is a whole category into itself. You're basically trying to establish a precedence of assembling parts. Another human factors consideration, by the way. Wire routing, tolerance stack-ups, establishing quality standards, snap fits, interference fits, adhesives, all these things are part of manufacturing. And, selection of screws, establishing torque levels for screws. These are all critical for medical products. You can't just tell somebody to put a screw in a hole. You have to tell them what is the torque level that you want that screw to be set to so you maintain quality. You don't have parts falling out in the field, falling apart in the field. And then verification of overall performance. And ease of assembly. A lot of times, the last thing you want to do is design something. I had a young man working for me one time. He worked for me for like a week until I fired him. He was a master's graduate in mechanical engineering, biomechanical engineering. He was a pretty smart guy. And he was a little bit too smart for his own good, because I gave him a simple project to design this very simple box. And he designed it, took him a week. And I walked over to him. He never asked me a question. I said, if you have any questions, come over and ask me. He never asked me anything. Then he came over, and I walked over to him at the end of the week, and I saw what he did. And he was like kind of proud and kind of cocky. And he said, yeah, there it is. He said, well, how do you assemble it? How do you put anything inside? It was actually an enclosed box. So, that sounds kind of funny, but it happens a lot. You'd be surprised. So, going through numerous iterative steps in your checks all along the way throughout your development process, you can assure that the guy or the man or woman who's assembling this thing at the end of your ingenious design is able to easily build it and reliably put it together consistently from time to time to time without having to be a brain surgeon, okay? And tolerance stack-ups, I've talked about it a few times already in this presentation. A critical part of designing for manufacturing. Understanding how numerous parts stack up and how to minimize the relationship between those various elements so you minimize those stack-ups to ensure that the parts all fit together reliably without having to machine them down and cut them down to size. Okay, I'm almost done. So, adding date stamps to your parts for injection molding is a critical part of anticipating how to track or trace parts once they're in the field. So if there's a failure or any type of problem, you can trace it back to a lot of material and a production date. And that's what that little date stamp is in the right-hand corner. Identifying pre-production parts so that you and your molder or your vendor can agree on what's acceptable and not acceptable on an ongoing basis. That's what those pictures to the left imply. These tools are used to establish torque levels. We don't have time to go into it. I wish I did. But that's a critical part of designing for plastics, because if you don't do that, you can easily cause premature failure or strip the tools, the screws will actually strip right out of the piece. And picking the right screw, selecting the right screw, the right hole size, etc. is critical. And, sometimes things that you don't even anticipate could creep up and bother you. For example, with fasteners, sometimes fasteners are coated with oils that you might not be aware of. And those oils are incompatible with the plastic, and you might not see the problem initially, but 6 months into the field, my parts are breaking, and you can't figure out why, because it worked when you shipped, it wasn't broken when you shipped it out the door. That's called stress cracking. It happens quite often. We designed this entire sub-assembly. Yeah, I know. 5 minutes, should I end it now, or?
No, you got 5 minutes.
Oh, okay,
How
good.
are you doing?
This entire, this product had an optical engine in it, which was quite sensitive. So we actually isolated it in this elastomeric cocoon, so to speak. And that entire subassembly was actually press fit into the body of the unit and suspended in there. It was compressed in place, so it was actually literally floating inside the unit. So, and when they when you all tested the product, the production unit, they dropped it onto a concrete floor from like 3 or 4 feet, and it bounced, and it bounced all over the place, and they picked it up and it still worked. They said, we've never seen anything like that. So, it was, now if that was hard mounted to the body, it would have probably failed. It probably wouldn't have broke, but it would have failed. And we did some simulations, these types of mechanical event simulations we could use, with certain FEA programs, which I've done in the past. They're somewhat reliable, but they're really not. It's pretty complicated to do one with an elastomeric wraparound like we had in this design. One of the things that was quite alarming in this particular design was we had these 2 lasers that were projected out to establish a focal distance for the camera. And they were mounted on this chassis, and they were diverging. And the temperature rise inside the unit was only about 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And I refused to believe that it was a thermal expansion issue. But I did a finite element analysis, and when you look at the physical properties of materials, you look at coefficient of thermal expansion, and you go by that. Well, that is only part of the equation. The other part of the equation is the rigidity of the material. Because the modulus, when you start expanding something, the structural integrity becomes a critical factor as well. And that was actually shown here in this FEA analysis. And the part was actually deforming and warping, and the laser beams were actually diverging. And it was only over a 30-degree Fahrenheit range, a pretty small range. In the end, that guy to the right, he's a good friend of mine, and he and I, he was the visionary in this product, and he's responsible for pulling it off in terms of putting the whole thing together. And we were fortunate enough to share the silver award for the MD&D last year, so it was a great project. I know I was fast, and I couldn't take too many questions, but thank you very much.
The HyperView imaging system is a newly available and unique device for addressing a large and growing population suffering from diabetes and vascular disease complications. By imaging hemoglobin in superficial tissue to determine oxygen levels, the device provides clinicians a new understanding of perfusion and tissue health, thereby leading to more informed treatment decisions. HyperView is a powerful diagnostic tool optimized for speed, mobility, ease of use, and clinical efficiency, enabling solutions for improved patient care and better economics for the clinical operator. HyperView represents a market-first imaging device packaging HyperMed's class-leading technology into an ultra-fast, handheld battery-operated device. There is no contact with the patient, and images are captured in less than 1 second without the need for injectable contrast agents. HyperMed's technology captures multiple wavelengths of visible light, and the proprietary algorithms compute levels of oxy and deoxyhemoglobin as well as oxygen saturation in superficial tissue. The large, high-resolution touchscreen display allows easy viewing of high-quality medical images and rapid analysis of patient data, without needing to leave the exam room. Fast and simple-to-use interactive diagnostic tools allow the clinician to understand localized oxygen delivery, tissue viability, and areas of ischemia, which could lead to further complications such as non-healing wounds and amputation. At its core, HyperView offers a new view into tissue perfusion by measuring biomarkers clinically relevant to applications such as diabetic foot ulcers, assessment of peripheral vascular disease, critical limb ischemia, as well as tissue viability in reconstructive surgery and amputations. Hypermed was the first company to commercialize hyperspectral technology for tissue oximetry and remains the market leader with over 10 years of established clinical efficacy. With our new FDA-cleared HyperView product, we continue our commitment to provide clinicians innovative solutions. HyperView represents a new standard of care that is affordable, clinically efficient, and completely non-invasive. Nothing in the market compares to the portability, ease of use, and speed of the HyperView imaging system.